May our panelists take the stage. Welcome to Friday Forum. I'm Steve Novick, a member of City Club's Forum Board. For more than 100 years, City Club of Portland is where civic-minded people have come together to find solutions to our region's biggest challenges. Today, we're a diverse network of people who are eager to learn, connect, and share ideas for a better Oregon. Thank you for joining us at the Sentinel Hotel in downtown Portland, where thousands of people are joining us online, on the radio, and on TV. Live viewers are watching on KGW's website, Facebook feed, and news app. Our radio audience is listening live via X-Ray FM stations, 107.1 FM and 91.1 FM. And TV viewers will watch today's program via Open Signal's community media television stations. We are incredibly grateful for the support of our media partners in bringing City Club forums to our community. In addition to City Club's valued media partners, our volunteers and staff enable us to put on Oregon's best civic programs week after week. A special thank you goes out to The Standard for sponsoring today's forum. Please join me in showing our appreciation to everyone who has made this event possible. Today's forum kicks off a three-part series on the fiscal challenges Oregon faces in the coming years. This spring, we'll talk about the unfunded liability Oregon carries, who needs to be at the table to help us all think differently about the challenges ahead, and what solutions will best serve the many communities in our state. It's a big topic, so let's get started. On our panel today is Jesse Beeson, President and CEO of Northwest Health Foundation. Previously, Jesse served as Northwest Health Foundation's Vice President of Strategy and Public Affairs, Executive Director of Proud Ground, and Senior Policy Director of Housing, Culture, and Planning for then Commissioner Sam Adams. Joining Jesse is John Toponia, President of Eco Northwest. Since 1997, John has built consulting practices in education, healthcare, human services, and tax policy for clients including the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Lumina Foundation, Idaho's Albertson Family Foundation, and Oregon's Chalkboard Project. Prior to joining Eco Northwest, John served as an analyst at the U.S. Congressional Budget Office, where he estimated the cost of Clinton-era welfare reform legislation. Moderating our discussion is Caitlin Baggett, known in some circles as the Wascally Baggett, the Executive Director of the North Star Civic Foundation, a private entrepreneurial foundation focused on crisis-level wealth inequality in our region. The foundation has supported research, economic analysis, and innovative policy development related to poverty and self-sufficiency in Oregon, as well as housing affordability and recently the fiscal health of local governments throughout the state. Please join me in welcoming our guests.
Steve, thank you for telling everybody my secret nickname. You've blown my cover. Everybody, it's really a huge honor to be here with all of you today. It's always wonderful to be at City Club and to see such a great turnout for this important event. We're talking today about Oregon's next 20 years. It's a conversation that connects budgets and taxes, our priorities and our promises. And this is a conversation that is for every person, community, jurisdiction, and sovereign nation in the state. It may sound wonky or complicated, because it is, but the aim for today's conversation is to start a new statewide approach, how we think about what we owe each other, and how we take care of each other. How we take care of our kids, the elderly, the places we call home, in communities, in our families, and across the next generation. Because here's the deal. None of you came to City Club today to learn if our state is financially out of balance. I suspect that you know that Oregon's economy is growing while teachers get pink slips. And that at a time when our state is attracting new businesses and generating new industries, we are shuttering libraries and limiting 911 service. What's happening doesn't make sense. And many of us, sometimes in different directions, are pursuing ways to solve these important challenges. The question is, what must we do differently, together, that will change the foreseeable trajectory in front of us. Today, I'm going to talk about 3 pivots that we can make together to move toward conversations and toward actions that will be needed to ensure a balanced and healthy fiscal future. The pivots are: 1, from state to local; 2, from biennial to generational; and 3, from political to civic. But before the pivots, 2 things. 1, I think I need water here. And 2, I want to give you a little bit of context about how we got here. 2 years ago, I asked a small group to study this issue. The Women's Foundation, the Ford Family Foundation, thank you, Steve, the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, Craft 3, and ALF Oregon. And what we wanted to understand was what the financial stresses that we'd been hearing about in the news and learning about from the communities that we are all working in, what those financial stresses would mean for communities and for the ongoing economic strength of our state. How long do we have to act? Who is the we that will need to act? And what is the scale at which we need to be designing solutions? We commissioned analysis to model the fiscal health of 35 local governments in Oregon through the year 2022. And our starting question was, from the perspective of an Oregon family, what does it mean if your kid's school is cutting teachers or school days? And in addition to that, the city that you live in and the county are limiting critical public services. And it turns out that local governments provide many of the services that we rely on most every day: libraries, health and mental health care, transit and road maintenance, police and fire protection, community parks, economic development, and housing. And what if on top of all of those things, the state is also tightening budgets? I need to give a really giant thank you to our partners in this research: Portland State University's Center for Public Service and Echo Northwest. They did outstanding work. Thank you. Over the last 2 years, our original group of 7 has grown to a couple of dozen. I will not name all of you now, but I see many of you in the audience, and it's really great to be here with you and to have worked on this with you for the last couple of years. The truth is, as we've worked together, as we've huddled over this issue, many of us have felt ill-equipped at some point in the last 2 years, for a couple of reasons. Highly technical policy issues have a tendency to eject newcomers. So as we today get further into this discussion, and you hear yourself saying, but I don't know enough about public asset management or tax law or whatever it is that trips you up or makes you feel uncomfortable or unsure, I invite you to stick with it. We need you to be engaged in solutions. If not, our positions have a tendency to grow from identity or ideology, and that makes this problem so much harder to solve. This issue has been deeply polarized. To move forward, we need to take a step back from the conversation as we've heard it. Labor versus business, Democrats versus Republicans, or pitting public workers against the public services that they provide. There are different and competing stories about how we got here. However, the financial challenges that we face now are bigger than adjudicating the history of what brought us to this point. But there are hard feelings about how we got here. Those feelings, if not addressed, threaten to constrain the set of solutions that we bring forward. These challenges look like hard math problems. They do not also need to be hard political problems. Instead, now is the time to talk about where we're going and how we get there together. So, where are we going? This, by the way, is the part of the speech about the data. This is the part where I normally look at my phone. I'm going to encourage you to stay with me. It's like 6 minutes. I know that you can do it. So, the research team asked, will local governments be able to provide the same services in 2022 that they provide today? For 30 of the 35 governments that we looked at, the answer is no. In Redmond, Roseburg, Hermiston, and Portland, the answer is no. They will not be able to provide the same services. In Klamath Falls, Newport, and Ontario, the answer is no. They will not be able to provide the same services. With additional projections, we see persistent, growing structural imbalances through the year 2037. That's 18 years of deteriorating conditions for our schools, our counties, and our cities. And at the bottom of that trend, it will reach an average annual imbalance of 6%. Is a 6% imbalance a lot? This is a fair question to ask. When I first saw the number, I had no context for it. Yeah, it's a lot. So for local governments, for schools, cities, and counties, it's about $2.7 billion in annual cuts. That does not include budget imbalances facing the state of Oregon itself. Underinvestment has been a key factor in this shortfall. Inflexible property taxes and a declining federal investments. You see, local governments pay for services and for obligations with property taxes. But in the 90s, tax rates were reduced and frozen by measures 5 and 50, and they cannot be changed without a statewide constitutional vote. And on the cost side, we have Oregon's pension plan. Each government, every public employer, is responsible for the costs related to their workers. A little history might be helpful here, particularly for those of us who weren't there. The policy decisions that have elevated the cost of Oregon's pension system started in the 1960s, and they extended through the 1990s. It's like from the Beatles to Nirvana. And just a quick show of hands, if you were born after the Beatles released their final album, Let It Be, in 1970. Oh, City Club is getting so much younger. In 2003, legislators took significant action. They created a new tier of the pension system for new employees, dramatically cutting benefits for the next generation of workers. But lawmakers did not take the critical next step. They did not identify a way to fund the significant legacy obligations of the past system through the last 16 years, at least not at the levels that public employers are about to see. Instead, they hoped that strong stock market returns would bail out the legacy system's outsized costs. Just the opposite happened. The stock market crash of 2007 compounded these mistakes, more than doubling legacy obligations in the system. And these legacy obligations now represent a large and growing share of government budgets. There are many ways to pay for the legacy obligations that were created more than a generation ago, before many of us were born. But here is the plan that we've inherited. We will pay for the legacy obligations over the next 20 years by withdrawing $30 billion from public services. Now might be the time to ask, is that our best plan? My daughter's a 6th grader. Under this plan, she will be 30 when we have finished paying for these past costs. I can't help but observe that that is all of middle school and high school and college. That's her first job, her first love, the start of her career, and her first home. All of that will take place under the shadow of these policy decisions. I need to tell you one more thing about the data, and then we'll talk about how to get to a more hopeful place. The modeling and assumptions underlying this story follow a trajectory in which Oregon's economy is strong and growing. It follows a trajectory in which stock market investments continue to beat the odds, and the cost of buying public workers' health insurance stabilizes. The story we're sharing here today is a best-case scenario model. As our learning group reviewed the final data, there was a feeling, maybe it's a feeling that you're having right now, reminiscent of the gut turn that many of us felt when we first really reckoned with the mega earthquake that is going to shake Cascadia in the next 50 years. The difference between the really big one and this coming fiscal breakdown is simple. We cannot stop an earthquake, but we can stop this financial crisis. Because this financial crisis is the result of our own public policies, not a stock market crash, not an act of nature. We designed this problem. Oregon governments and voters have the tools to determine when financial hardships will hit, how deeply they will impact communities today and in the future, and perhaps most importantly, which communities will carry the heaviest burden by income level, by geography, by race, and by generation. I'm going to say as concretely as I can the kinds of things that we're going to need to do. As we learn together, we can improve this conversation, but here's a place to start. This is tough. I'm saying that we can solve this. I'm not saying that it will be easy. We have to make meaningful decisions. We have to make them together, and we have to make them on time. To do that, as we move forward, I recommend 3 fundamental pivots in how we as Oregonians think about and approach this state's fiscal future. Pivot 1, from state to local. As long as we identify Salem as the problem and the state budget as the focus, we miss the full scale of the issue. When designing solutions, we should not separate the needs of state and local governments and the communities that they serve together. Doing so misses the larger share of the financial hardship, but also the interdependence of those budgets. And maybe most importantly, it ignores the reality that Oregonians experience all the benefits of living in this wonderful state in community, not agency by agency or bureau by bureau. This does not mean that there's no role for Salem. Understand, there are solutions that address the size and the timing of this challenge, and all of them require a partnership between state and local governments. Lawmakers could look to Illinois and New Jersey for ideas, states that have been forced into leadership because their problem is so severe. They've identified new sources of revenue to fund their PERS liabilities, new taxes, lottery funds, asset and bond sales. And they're seeking to extend the state's timetable for buying down for paying down the debt to prevent competition between asset management decisions and community priorities. They're also working in partnership with public workers to accept early retirement buyouts and take pressure off of system financing. At the end of the day, the math problem here requires a timely combination of three things: new revenue, restructured debt and assets, and prioritized investments. And in our report, which we published today, we begin to explore options for each and to focus on tools that are available to lawmakers to create a structured solution to the state's unfunded liability. Pivot 2. From biennial to generational. Oregon lawmakers are required to balance budgets on a yearly or biennial basis, and this is wildly out of step with the generational nature of this challenge. One-off strategies to patch and cut will have one predictable outcome. Oregonians will be asked to make sacrifices in a time of crisis, because we didn't plan ahead. And they won't be one-time sacrifices. The imbalances will require adjustments year after year through 2037. We can do better than that. We have to do better than that because we know what happens when we ask communities to make a sacrifice in a time of crisis. Black and Latino and Indigenous people, elderly people, women, people living on low incomes, people with disabilities, our friends, our neighbors, the people we love are asked to make the deepest sacrifices in those situations. Lawmakers can get Oregon out of crisis mode now by setting a new timetable for digesting these costs, a timetable that stabilizes local services and public offerings, a timeline that opens the table, the conversational table, to new voices and new perspectives in developing solutions. And that brings me to the third pivot, from political to civic. New perspectives are going to be essential for creating solutions that are innovative and relevant and centered in our community values. We need to reset the table on this conversation. We know that there are great ideas in Oregon, and we're not going to get them unless we bring more people to the table who can help us answer a set of critical questions that should be at the center of our inquiry before we take action. Here are the questions. They're a way of comparing the path that we're on now and the policy that we're living in with any new proposal that is brought forward. How do these two different options impact this generation and the next? How do these options impact us across race and class? How do these options impact the unique economic development needs of rural Oregon? And how do these options set the stage for Oregon's future economic health and for shared growth? As we start to talk about solutions, let's start by talking about our values. The conversation will be enriched and relevant if there are more stakeholders at the table. And that's why I'm saying that now is the time for leaders in philanthropy to consider how to support capacity in communities so that they can participate fully and powerfully in these conversations going forward. Philanthropy in Oregon may be in a really unique position to think not one generation out, but 100 years out. Philanthropy can also ensure that the voices and expertise of communities of color and low-income communities are centered and engaged in ways that fast legislative deals tend to miss. My invitation to philanthropy is to begin this work soon. Our timeline to act needs to recognize that nobody is pushing pause on this crisis while we deliberate what our role might be. And ultimately, legacy investments in communities will all be downstream from this financial reality. Today, I'm also going to make a special plea to those of us who raised our hands, those of us in our 30s and 40s. This is our generation's most important work in Oregon. Our generation needs to join this conversation, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it feels dangerous, and even if we don't feel ready. Okay, I've said the word conversation a lot. Conversation will not be enough. We have a unique opportunity in the next 2 years to set a new path for communities in our state. And here's where you can start. This weekend, and through the rest of this legislative session, when you hear about Oregon's financial choices, pay attention to the frame. Do messengers or the media seek to drive a wedge between business and labor in Oregon, who should be on the same side for the future of our state? When a friend or a colleague observes that we need to fix PERS, ask, are you talking about benefits or legacy obligations, or is it something else? What do you mean by that? See if you can help inform a more complete conversation. And in the coming month, North Star will begin developing a conversation guide. This is like your Thanksgiving primer. It'll give us a little bit of input about how to talk to our friends and neighbors and colleagues in a way that's not about pointing fingers and maybe saves us from losing friends. We want to know from you. What do you need? What's hard to talk about? How can we converse across differences in a way that moves us toward meaningful decisions together and on time? What the data tells me is that nobody in this room or in the radio, if you're in our listening audience, can sit on the sidelines right now. John, Jesse, and I are here today to start a conversation with Oregon about what we're learning. We're not here with a united policy proposal. And in fact, as individuals, there are places where we do not see eye to eye. But where we do see eye to eye on this is the need to accelerate a new approach to solving this problem in the next 2 years. So let's start talking. John and Jesse, I'm going to invite you to come on up here. We'll have an organic conversation between the three of us and with members of the audience. It's time for us to start talking about our next 20 years, and then we can talk about the 20 years after that. Thank you. Oh, it's me again. For our radio audience, this is City Club at Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Caitlin Baggett, Executive Director of the North Star Civic Foundation, and I'm here today talking about Oregon's fiscal future with Jesse Beeson, President and CEO of Northwest Health Foundation. Hello, Jesse. And John Toponia, President of Echo Northwest.
Hello.
So let's start off with a simple question for each of you. What brings you to this conversation? I'm going to start with you, Jesse.
Okay. What's a health foundation doing here? So I think for us at the foundation, we know that health comes from a lot of things. It comes from a good education, a good job, a sound economy, safe communities. And we've struggled and wrestled with and finally acknowledged that those things are actually driven by public policy, by public practice, by public resources. And that's what determines who gets the good stuff, right? And so when we saw how big this problem was that Oregon was facing, we didn't think we could sit it out. So many, the health of generations of Oregonians is at stake, and so we got to be in the room.
Thanks, John.
Well, Echo Northwest is a likely suspect here. We've been doing public policy work in the state of Oregon since 1974, when the assumed earnings rate of the PERS fund was 5.5%. So since then, we have done hundreds and hundreds of reports for local governments across the state, cities, counties, school districts, water districts, parks, transit, etc. And we've seen, not only seen this problem coming, but we've been actively engaged in it. I have twice defended or attempted to defend the state's PERS reforms in front of Greg Hartman and the Supreme Court Special Master, and at one point advised the Revenue Restructuring Committee for Governor Kulongoski.
John, you have been working on this issue for a long time. What keeps you going and what feels hopeful about this conversation today?
What keeps me going? General persistence. But in terms of hope, I've always been hopeful in the context of Oregon. I mean, just looking out at this crowd and how many people have come to engage in this conversation makes me hopeful. Oregon seems to be a state that is still of a scale where you can convene an appreciable number of people and solve big problems. And I feel like Oregon has an advantage there relative to places like California. I'm also very helpful that the foundation communities have gotten engaged, because trust in institutions is not at an all-time high. There are many institutions that folks don't trust, but foundations are still trusted. And so I think foundation leadership going forward on this topic is critical and makes me hopeful.
Jesse, as you've dug in over the last year, what surprised you the most about learning about this issue?
I would say a few things. One, there isn't one reason, and you talked about this in your speech, there isn't one reason why we're in this place, right? It is a series of well-intentioned and then also bad decisions over the last 30 years that have disinvested in communities and got us to this point. So I think that was a shocker for me, because the media says it's really this one issue. It's not. Two, I think I was shocked that there's no plan. That our plan is to take $30 billion out of public services for the next 18 years, instead of like an actual plan that addresses the crisis. So I thought smarter people than me had already come up with a plan. Third, that there is no one in the state that is compiling all of the work that the public sector does in understanding meaningfully how much money are we talking about? What is the crisis? Right? It took Caitlin with a wonky question and a bunch of people and a bunch of philanthropists to actually understand the compilation of the crisis. So all those shocked me.
John, as we've been talking over the last year, you and I have had a lot of some tough conversations, good conversations, learning together. Could you talk a little bit about how your thinking is evolving on this issue?
Well, in terms of evolution, the problem has evolved a little bit more than my thinking. The issue here is, I mean, you can go back to the revenue restructuring report from more than 10 years ago, or you can go back to studies on PERS from, we knew that was a problem in the early 90s and tried to reform it. It is really remarkable how much foresight we've had that this problem was coming, and we have made some changes along the way. This problem would be much worse if the legislature hadn't courageously made some changes in 2003. And we have made some tax changes over time at the state level, but insufficiently. And so now here we are, sort of at the doorstep of some a real shift in the delivery of public service. And so that urgency, it becomes, like you say, the big one, a focusing event of the problem that is very different than it's ever been in the past.
We're talking about broadening a conversation, and in that spirit, we've asked a couple of people to share some observations or a question with us from community groups. And I'm going to start, I'm just looking around the room for who has the microphone. And start with, the microphone is over here. Ashley Henry with Business for a Better Portland. Would love to hear an observation or question. What do you want to add to this conversation?
Thanks so much, Caitlin. My name is Ashley Henry. I'm the executive director of a group called Business for a Better Portland. We're a membership organization that represents over 300 companies and organizations in the Portland metropolitan area that take a holistic perspective about what it means to be good for business. And what's good for business is a community that has affordable housing, that provides for quality education, and a lot of other things that I'm sure we all share concerns about. My question today is actually for John. I'm curious, how do Oregon's corporate taxes compare to the national average, and what would our revenues look like in this state if we actually had a corporate tax in our state that was on about the national average?
All right, so I think this has been fairly well disseminated in no small part because of the Measure 97 campaign. Oregon consistently, from Ernst & Young and Anderson Consulting and other, ranks near the end of the distribution, the tail end, the small end of the distribution on state and local business taxation. Most of our taxes, if you look across corporate income taxes, property taxes, et cetera, S-corp taxes, pass-through taxes, et cetera, are average. Where the big difference comes in is that we do not have a retail sales tax, and so consequently businesses do not pay taxes on their inputs to production when the materials and supplies that they use to make the things that they make. And so consequently that is what puts us at that end of the distribution. The number that I think is in Caitlin's report, we calculated, and I don't have it off the top of my head, but it would be quite a bit more if we were at the national average.
I remember it.
Thank you, Caitlin.
So it was $1.6 billion per year.
If we were at the national average.
Thank you, Ashley. Ana Del Rocio with ColorPack. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, yes, my name is Ana Del Rocio. I serve as the Executive Director of Oregon Futures Lab and ColorPack. With our partners, we uplift leaders of color to enter public office and govern effectively across Oregon. A couple of points struck me in your presentation, Caitlin. Firstly, your first pivot from state to local. That really underscores what we often talk about around the need for elected officials to be truly accountable to their constituents. We don't live in either a state or a city or a county. We live in all of them, and we deserve leaders that not only understand the cross-jurisdictional nature of this crisis, but will also be committed to work in a cross-jurisdictional way to solve it. It's also why we uplift leaders that both look like the communities they serve and work to transform the ways their bodies of government engage with those same communities. So it's going to be critical, if we are to avoid this earthquake, to invest, like you said, in the capacity of directly impacted communities, rural communities, people of color, people living on low incomes, to organize, because that strong community organizing infrastructure is the vehicle through which we will hold all elected officials accountable for the way they lead us through the next several generations. My question is, what will it take to broaden the understanding of that need to invest in that capacity? Because Jesse and the Northwest Health Foundation has been a very strong partner locally in increasing and maximizing that capacity, and we can see a lot more of that. And what do you think it will take to get there?
Well, I think it looks like a few things. I think it does look like the philanthropic community stepping up in new ways and not just being a responsive grant maker, but to say this project facing Oregon is worth investing in new leadership to get up to speed on the issue, get up to speed on the possible solutions, and to be invited in the rooms they're currently not being invited in to help develop solutions. So I think there's a role for philanthropy. I also think there's a role for elected officials to end the idea that the business community and the labor community are proxy for the people that actually live in our communities. We need different kinds of voices to develop different kinds of solutions. And if the political process that led us here, if we think that's the one that's going to lead us out, we're crazy. So that's what.
And finally, Gustavo with UValkyrie. Can you introduce yourself and offer an observation or a question?
Hello, my name is Gustavo Morales. I'm the Executive Director of UValkyrie. We're a nonprofit based in Eastern Oregon. We serve 8 counties, and we focus on developing the social capital and the leadership capacity of community members. My question to you, we serve in 8 rural communities, or excuse me, 8 rural counties. The majority of the higher wage jobs are held by employees of the city, state, and county. What are the implications and impact that this would have on rural communities, and especially if this issue is not addressed?
John or Jesse, either of you want to?
Sure. No, this is absolutely critical for rural counties. What is different about Oregon than many other parts of the country is that our rural counties are either flat or growing slightly in population, unlike the plains and unlike rural parts of the Midwest. So the timber belt is doing better than the corn belt is doing better than the rust belt. And so it's a population strategy with respect to keeping those communities vibrant and prosperous. You absolutely have to have well-functioning local government in order for those communities to be welcoming and to continue to be a place that older people and others want to migrate to. There has to be a strong social safety net, a strong healthcare system, or people are going to stop moving into rural Oregon, and economies will struggle.
Great. We have time for one more question among the 3 of us before we open up the mic to the rest of the audience. I know you're all dying to ask us questions. Quick answers from both of you. Is this primarily a technical problem, designing the solutions, a political problem, or something else?
I'd say you need 3 things to change public policy. You need a clear problem statement. I think we have it. If you don't believe it, pick up the document you walked in. That's the problem statement. You need policy solutions. As I say, there have been dozens of technical studies done on this, and as much as I hate to say it, as somebody who runs a policy shop, we don't need many more studies. And that leaves the 3rd component, which is the political ways and means to understand the problem and pick up the solutions and implement them. So I would say this is 90 to 95% a political issue. It is not a technical one anymore.
I mean, I agree it's a political issue. I think it's also a civic issue. I think that the opportunity has been framed narrowly around a very specific problem of PERS, right? And I think for the communities that we serve, they see the scale of this problem and they actually think that there's more than just one solution on the table, right? People want to talk about reforming our property tax system. They also know that Measure 11 has driven costs as well and also broken up families. They want to talk about that. They want to talk about different voices and different leadership. So I think it is a political problem, and I think it is incumbent upon us to make it a civic solution.
For our radio audience, this is City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Caitlin Baggett, Executive Director of the North Star Civic Foundation. I'm here today talking about Oregon's fiscal future with Jesse Beeson, President and CEO of the Northwest Health Foundation, and John DePonia, President of Echo Northwest. Let's now go to the audience for some questions. Everyone watching or listening today is welcome to ask a question. If you've written a question on an index card, hold it high for City Club staff to collect. You may also submit questions via Twitter using the hashtag FridayForum. And to City Club members who would like to ask a question at the microphone, please identify yourself as a member and ask one question in 30 seconds or less.
Hi, I'm Jim Labby, City Club member. About a year ago, about 100 Oregonians gathered in East Portland, the Rosewood Initiative, to learn about participatory budgeting, which is a deliberative democratic process wherein ordinary community members can allocate a portion of a municipal budget through a binding decision or vote. It's one mechanism for allowing ordinary people to exercise real power and real responsibility over these budget decisions. It's spread from Brazil since the late 80s. It's spread in North America since 2001, Chicago 2009. Came to the Northwest in 2016. it's in Washington and British Columbia. It has yet to come to Oregon. Where do you see it as a possible solution to that third piece, pivoting from the political to the civic?
So this is a question about how to build civic engagement and civic understanding of budgets. And thank you very much for asking it and for the work you're doing. It sounds kind of cool. We offer 4 recommendations in the report. One of them is for local governments to look seriously at ways to engage citizens more actively in the budgeting process. So this seems like something worth exploring. We also look at some tools that are available in and being used in Connecticut and Texas and in Washington that help voters see how, forecasted into the future how budget decisions will impact public services. Thank you.
Bill Dickey, City Club member. This problem reminds me of what it is like to convince an alcoholic to seek treatment. I would like to know in a couple of classic ways what the bottoming out is going to be like for this state, because I think when that really happens, when they just like close, like they say, sorry, you don't have a fire department anymore, then people are going to wake up and say, okay, I'm ready to pony up. So explain to us a couple of really scary things that are going to happen so people can get it to their head that this is a real active problem that needs to be solved.
All right, I'll take that one. We've had flashes of what this will look like already. If you go back to the tech recession of the early 2000s, school funding dropped quickly and unexpectedly, and we ended up in Portland with shortened school years, and we were in Doonesbury. PSU's Professor Ethan Seltzer said Oregon, we were the poster child of that recession. Said that Oregon was going to be known as Mississippi with fir trees. So that was one flash. Another flash would be when the federal timber payments unexpectedly, well, they didn't unexpectedly drop, they, with great forecast, dropped, and Josephine County had no sheriff's service on the weekends. There was a national story by National Public Radio of a woman who was fleeing domestic violence, locked herself in her house, called 911, and 911 couldn't find anyone to come. You think of Grover Norquist and this notion of government so small you could drown it in a bathtub. That's what it looks like in Josephine County, or it looked like in 2013, 2014. Now, it may not, hopefully, ever get to be that bad in the future, but it's going to be versions of that, and it's going to be sustained. This is a 6% drop in budgets. For public services, that will be like entering a recession and not exiting it for 20 years.
My dad knew that drinking was bad for him. The painting the direst pictures was not actually what got him to stop. What got him to stop was being called to what it meant for his family. And I think the metaphor applies here. Caitlin said, the question is, what do we owe each other? It is a moral question about what our responsibility is to our neighbor and to those that come after us. So I think we do need to understand the impacts, but I think we also need to call ourselves to a higher moral question about what's really at stake here and what is the compact that we have between each other.
Ted Kay, City Club member. John, you attributed the low corporate tax burden to the lack of a retail sales tax in Oregon. I've come to believe that there are two major reasons why Oregonians don't like sales tax. One is they don't trust politicians with more money, or they don't trust that other taxes will go down with a retail sales tax. And two, they hate being nickeled and dimed at the cash register. Do any of you believe, any of you comment on the idea of a value-added tax as a pseudo-sales tax that would solve the second problem if the first problem could be resolved as well?
Yes, I mean, I was deeply involved in the gross receipts tax work in Measure 97, and essentially where we have landed, because Oregonians have voted 9 times against a transparent, clear consumption tax, we are now working into other less transparent versions of it. So count me as one in favor of that. I would prefer that we could do a statewide campaign and have more conventional taxing on consumption, more transparent taxation. But the alternatives that are being discussed in the Capitol today, the one that has been advanced by the business community, those that have been advanced by others, are certainly an improvement upon what we had in Measure 97, and probably more politically viable than a retail sales tax.
Good afternoon. My name is Marissa Johnson. I'm a City Club member. I also work with an organization called Foster Homes of Healing, and we've been in conversations with state agency, the governor's office, and the legislators regarding the budget around social services through DHS. And I'm just wondering, we've had a lot of conversation today about the necessity of creating some mechanisms to pay for our coming ballooning expenses. But I also wanted to know if there's been much conversation in your group about the possible necessity of responsibly reducing the cost of social services in the state.
Marissa, can you clarify the question? Are you looking for thoughts about program delivery?
Well, I'm thinking, there's 2 sides to this coin. There's coming up with the money to backfill the hole, and then there's reducing the cost. And, when we're talking about the political divide in this state, we come down on 2 sides of this story. A lot of folks on one side of the spectrum believe that there's a great necessity to reduce costs in the first place, and on the other side, we believe that there's not enough service being offered. So my thought is that the solution is probably somewhere in the middle, and I just wanted to know if you guys had had any conversation about responsibly reducing cost as part of services that will be affected by the ballooning costs in PERS as time moves forward.
I'll take a first shot at replying to your question. As we've been looking at this, we've also identified a third place where problem solving could happen. Metaphors can be helpful for understanding complex issues, and the metaphor that keeps coming to me is the metaphor of a mortgage. A family can buy a house that is in their price range and that meets their needs, and they can either get a 15-year mortgage or a 30-year mortgage. And the 15-year mortgage means that they are paying more quickly and ultimately paying less, but that every month they need to pay a little bit extra. Whereas a 30-year mortgage is a slower process with more affordable costs all along the way. A third section of problem solving around this is not how do we find new money or how do we cut services, but how do we refinance the obligations that are underlying, that are underneath all of the cost drivers that we're seeing. It is more complicated than that, and simply choosing a 30-year mortgage instead of a 15-year mortgage would not be sufficient, but it is a third set of questions. Either of you want to add on?
I would just add that as we're thinking about solutions, keeping the categories of solutions as broad as possible, including service reforms, et cetera, is critical, because when you start taking things off the table and saying, well, no, we're not going to touch this and we're not going to change that, et cetera, it just puts so much more pressure on the handful of options that you leave actionable.
Good afternoon, I'm Mary Nolan, I'm a City Club member. Thank you for having this conversation. It's a great thing for us to do, and I appreciate, your invitation for all of us to be engaged. And particularly, Jesse, I appreciate your call of this as a moral and community obligation. What I haven't heard yet in the discussion is comments about the effect of shifts in responsibility for paying for services that the community as a whole needs and enjoys. And I'm talking about income inequality and the divide in incomes, where now we have a system where we would probably all agree that a progressive tax system is appropriate, but in fact in Oregon, the top quintile of personal earners pays a lower combined tax rate to support services for the community than the lowest quintile, and I'd like some comments about how we address that. And on the shift between whether people, human breathing people, or corporations pay, many of us remember a time when businesses paid half the cost of public services, local and state, in Oregon, and now they pay less than 30% of the cost to those. And how have those shifts complicated the solutions that we're seeking here?
Those are great questions, and we'll have to answer them briefly now and at length over cocktails.
I would say that Oregon, in a relative sense, has one of the more progressive systems of taxation in the country. We do, and we happen to be juxtaposed against a state that has the most regressive system of taxation in the United States. So it is challenging if we are to think about becoming even more progressive as we attempt to raise dollars. There may be a little bit of room there, but not a tremendous amount of room given our starting point.
Our time is up, I'm afraid. We'll have to pause the conversation for now, but it will continue. Please join me in thanking Andrew Cowlick for producing today's program, our guests for sharing their expertise, our sponsor, The Standard, for helping us make a space for this critical conversation, and all of you for being here today. We are adjourned.